my book really focuses on helping pastors figure out how to develop a disciple-making culture in their church. But it also fits for other organizations that are looking for that same sort of thing. And so it looks at how do we do it? How do we take something that we want to be different in the culture? How do we move it forward? And it would work. The process that I talk about in the book, it pairs with Jesus' model, but it also pairs with secular models that have come out and become the standard, which is not a surprise to me because Jesus did it first and modeled it. But it looks at how do we develop a team that is going to first model and become what we want the rest of the culture to become. So one of the things that I've noticed is leaders that want to lead it, but they're not willing to live it. And the whole premise of the book is you can't do what we're talking about in the book if you're not willing to live it and to model it. I don't have the secrets of the universe, but I've learned a few things over the past 10 years of working with pastors and church leaders from all different denominational backgrounds who have the same desire. And that desire is, how do I develop a disciple-making culture that lasts? And what some of them come to me with, the experience they've had is, hey, I've tried this program, I've tried that program, and it seems to have some momentum at the front end. But after a couple years of disciple-making success or apparent success, it kind of falls in on itself and the momentum dies off and it feels like we're back to square one.
Are you saying to me that Matthew 28 doesn't account or apply to your thinking here, Dr. Monroe?
Oh, no, no, no. Matthew says, teach them my commandments. And Jesus and all the synoptics says, love God and love, in Matthew especially, do we really, as part of discipleship, teach people to live up to the Sermon on the Mount? We tend to reduce discipleship to evangelism and Bible study, not a life submitted to Christ where we're loving other people the way he taught us to. You can't love God and money. When's the last time you heard that from a pulpit?
So if I get done reading this book, Raymond's getting off the elevator, I'm getting on because I'm riding with you up to the penthouse for your book signing there in downtown Chicago. So if I'm riding up the elevator with you and I turn to you and I go like, okay, Justin, read the book, love the book. Can I borrow a metaphor about aviation and just say, look, after I read your book, am I going to know how to fly the plane? Folks, welcome to the Disciple Dilemma. We're about to talk about a disciple-making culture with Justin Gravitt with Navigators Church Ministry. Justin's been with us before. Raymond and I are about to explore with Justin this whole thing about, is it really about one-on-one discipleship, or is culture really something that matters? Raymond, what are you looking for today as we talk to Justin?
I really am interested in talking with Justin about the disciple-making culture that you have to create. And the book focuses a lot on the process and organizing the team and the obstacles that you have to overcome and the management strategies and personal strategies you can use to do that. But he certainly includes the need to love one another and the relational aspect of really building things together. But that's a lot of institutional language for we need to make friends and work together to accomplish the mission of the church. So I'm hopeful that we can balance both the need to really try to make something happen and change the culture, the goal you and I share, that culture needs to be changed on the one hand, but also not lose sight of the fact that this is not a business MBA program. This is about a community of people who are supposed to love one another and work together to advance the kingdom of God.
Okay, everybody, Justin Gravitt, the Director of Innovation at Navigators Church Ministries, is up next with his new book, Foundation for a Disciple-Making Culture, Building a Core Team to Awaken Discipleship. Here we go. Justin Gravitt, welcome back to the Disciple Dilemma.
Thank you. Always great to be with you guys. Good to see you again.
Raymond, what are you doing? What's going on in your world?
I'm getting ready to go and try and teach Boy Scouts Saturday to blacksmith. It's a great discipleship opportunity. Every disciple of Christ needs to know how to blacksmith.
Well, I'm curious, sort of as a warm-up question for us all to kind of get our joints loosened up and get ready to talk about Justin's new book. So So I'll toss the first bomb to Ray, and then you can pass it off to Justin. You walk into your church, right? And you are confronted with somebody asking the question, where do you stand politically? What's a disciple to do?
I believe that, as you and I have talked about any number of times, we need to find a way of having an ordinary conversation about what it means to be a disciple in a complicated world where there are no good outcomes, at least not any clear paths that we can choose. And so I would give the terrible evangelical response. I think we need to pray for the future of our country.
Okay. All right. Okay. I like that. That's a start, right? Justin, how about you? You get confronted with this, where are you politically? What's a disciple to do there?
Yeah, starting off with the easy ones, huh?
Yeah.
So I would say that what's most important is that we align ourselves with Jesus. And one of the images that come to mind about this question about how Jesus handled it is when, Jesus was asked about paying the taxes, and then he went out and told him, go find the fish, gonna have coin in its mouth, and they find it and they pay it with that, right? Another time, whose face is on this thing? Oh, it's Caesar's. And so it's almost like that sort of a dilemma or a question of like, all right, how do I stand with Jesus without going against and inflaming people that have their alignments, they're aligned politically in one way or another, and that's super important to them. Well, how do I communicate in such a way that shares the truth of who Jesus is and what's really important to him without alienating people who on both sides are trying to do the same thing? So, like Raymond said, I think we need a lot of prayer. I think we need a lot of grace because, I see room in both parties for really communicating about the truth of the gospel and what Jesus stands for.
Dennis, before you move on, I remember you talking about when you were over in England, taking training about evangelism and that sort of thing, and that one of the key insights you thought was there when someone comes up and asks you that kind of question, that you're confident that there's something behind that question. So how would you answer that question to get behind the question to find out what's really going on with the person that asked it, and to try and get to sort of the root of what it means to follow Christ for that particular person, especially since you're in a church setting?
This is the problem with not asking questions fast enough. Raymond throws grenades back at me, and that puts me on a hot seat. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting question to raise, just like we're grappling with this one. First of all, in my view of the universe, of the culture that we live in today, thinking about the Western Gen Z, the Western millennial, and these very razor's edge, highly divisive, controversial, angering, amped up, energy-laden questions, what I find it's most useful for me as a conversation as a disciple is to walk deeper into the question, right? What's really behind that question? You hear a lot of people talking about understanding the questioner rather than the question. And it becomes like, well, Raymond, when you ask me which side am I on, can you give me a little more context about why you're asking the question? I'm just trying to understand where you're coming from before I blabber something out, which in about 80% of my experience throws a switch like, okay, the temperature just went down a little bit and I get to start explaining. 20% of the time I'm with someone who's like, oh no, you're not getting off with that. You got to give me an answer. It's either A or B, right? This would be like SEC football, Raymond. Are you Auburn or are you Alabama? Which one are you? Come on, man. You gotta pick a side. There ain't no waffling on this, but I think for us as disciples, as we get into talking about Justin's book today, The Foundation of a Disciple-Making Culture, as leaders, do we have kind of a reflexive capacity to really understand these human beings that we're interacting with, get their story before I just make a bunch of assumptions and toss an answer? And not that you guys were doing that a minute ago either. I thought they were great answers, but I'm just saying that there's this tendency that I have always had in my life. It's like, well, snarky answer soon to follow as soon as you shut up and let me, like, whoa, stop that.
Randy Newman, you remember when we were talking to him and he said, well, when he first became a Christian, he would approach people saying, well, since I know the truth and you don't, I'm supposed to talk and you're supposed to shut up and listen. And I'm hopeful that you'll say, you're right, and pray the prayer at the end. And he said, that's just absolutely crazy. So, Justin, when you look at discipleship, how critical is it to really be that engaged and listen? How much of because a lot of your stuff was really a leadership. When I went through your book, it was really about leadership. How do I organize? How do I create a structure and a community that moves this stuff forward? And so there was a lot of sort of top-down intentionality built in. So how do you balance the sort of top-down intentionality with the need to really engage with people?
Yeah. So the book I just wrote, right, that's coming out is really designed for church leaders and disciple makers. So you're right, it is kind of targeting kind of those who are at the top of a church, at the top of an organization. And part of why I wrote the book is because I've seen over and over again that a lot of those leaders, some of them see the value of disciple making. Some of them are trying to move disciple making forward in their organization or their church, but they're not sure how to do it so that it spreads. And so they quickly become frustrated, or they go down different roads that appear to have success behind it. They appear to be working for a period of time. But after a year, 2, 3, sometimes even up to 5 years, it looks like it's working and then it implodes. And so after seeing that in real life happen over and over again, I wanted to provide something that would be helpful for them to bring about cultural change in their church, in their organization, that would then spread outside of that. Now, I have another resource that I put out maybe 6 months ago that's really designed for the everyday believer. It's called the Bicycle Illustration. It's available for free on my website digitally. And it is really designed for people who are like, I've heard about this disciple making thing. I don't think I can do it. And how do we help somebody like that? And so whether that is somebody, maybe you're listening and you're like, that's me, or maybe you're trying to help somebody like that. That's a different resource that I've created for that type of audience. But yeah, I think it's a both and, right? Sometimes I'm asked about that. Well, is it top down or grassroots? And I've found it depends what outcomes we're trying to go for. But if we want culture change, it's both and. We can't just do one.
You two just gave a really interesting answer about how you deal with an individual who's got a very significant cultural question, which leads us to the idea of institutions and organizations that have very firm, solid convictions, whether right, wrong, good, or bad, about the way they run their business, the way they do things. And now I'm starting to lean toward the idea of churches, generally, sometimes parachurches, that we have an institutional organization that thinks the way that it thinks and behaves the way that it behaves. And then Justin shows up with this book, Foundation of a Disciple-Making Culture. Justin, how are you going to get in there and change a bunch of old geezers like me to start thinking differently about disciple making? Have you got the secrets of the universe locked up in this book? Tell us about the book and take us on a journey of how this works.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I don't have the secrets of the universe, but I've learned a few things over the past 10 years of working with pastors and church leaders from all different denominational backgrounds who have the same desire. And that desire is, how do I develop a disciple-making culture that lasts? And what some of them come to me with, the experience they've had is, hey, I've tried this program, I've tried that program, and it seems to have some momentum at the front end. But after a couple years of disciple-making success or apparent success, it kind of falls in on itself and the momentum dies off and it feels like we're back to square one. And so how do we take that reality of program after program being laid over our unchanged lives to get to something that's going to impact people, transform them, and then set as a part of the culture that's baked into the culture? How do we do that in such a way that we get those outcomes that we're looking for? And so the book moves into those questions right away and very directly. And I talk about there's two things really that the book is doing. One is it's helping disciple making leaders figure out how do we make disciples within a church or within another organization. But the other question is, how do we develop a culture of that so we don't just have, disciple makers that are disconnected within the culture who aren't pulling the sled together? How do we get them to pull the sled together? And guys, I've been with you before, and you've probably heard me say, I believe that Jesus's way of making disciples is the best way. And so, what I look at in the book is how did Jesus develop these 12 guys into a team that really helped them move disciple making, move the Jesus movement forward into all the world, all nations, so that we're still talking about it here today.
Yeah, no, Justin. One of the things that's really struck me after working with Dennis for a couple of years now on this project is a misunderstanding of the Great Commission, that making a disciple means giving people a new identity, and the commandments that we're supposed to do is love one another the way Jesus loved us. So how much of creating that culture is not programmatic or institutional, but modeling on the part of the leaders in terms of the relationships they build, not only with their team, but with other people?
Yeah, I see that as well. Right. So, one of the things that I've noticed is leaders that want to lead it, but they're not willing to live it. And the whole premise of the book is you can't do what we're talking about in the book if you're not willing to live it and to model it. But what the book moves through is it says, okay, if you're a disciple making leader and you want this, how do you get it? How do we build change into a culture, whether it's been established for a long period of time, 100+ year churches, or whether it's somewhat of a newer church, or whether it's even a church plant? How do we do that? And so one of the things that I've learned is that team is really important. You have to build a team. And I looked at, all right, how did Jesus do that? Well, he had his 12 disciples. Okay, but what did he actually do with them? Right? How did he start with them? And then what does it mean to team together as opposed to being a group? And then I started to look at the Christian culture that we live in within the churches and the secular culture that we live in every day as we move throughout our communities. And the reality is, most of us are influenced deeply by consumerism. We want to scale things really quickly. We want to move things as fast as they can. And we're much more interested in production than we are in reproduction. And so with teaming together, though, it requires something more than just being a group member. As churches, we're really good at being in groups together. We hear a lot about that. We talk a lot about it. There's a lot of opportunities for it. But there's a difference between being in a group and being in a team. And it requires something different. And I think part of the big difference between a group and a team is, one, there's a common goal that we're all pulling together towards. But two is we recognize that we bring something to the team that is apart from ourselves, right? So, when we've been trying to do these in churches, guys, one of the things that we hit against every time is we'll set out expectations really clearly. Hey, this is what we're trying to do, et cetera, et cetera. I want you to be committed to this. And, people are like, yeah, we're in. And 2 or 3 months down the road of, a year initially that they're together, meeting every other week, 2 or 3 months down the road, somebody will shoot an email off or a text off 10 minutes before the meeting. Hey guys, can't make it tonight. Aunt Mabel's in town this week and we're going to go to dinner. Now, I love Aunt Mabel. I think it's great that we go to dinner with Aunt Mabel, but she's in town for a week. Why do you have to go to dinner tonight? And would we ever do this if you were a part of a sports team and you had a game that night? Would you shoot off and text to the coach and the team, guys, can't make it, going to dinner? I don't think we would, right? Because we recognize there's something different. If I'm part of a team, it matters if I'm there. And it doesn't just matter to me, it matters to the rest of the team. And I think, again, that's just one of many examples that I could pull out about there's a difference between being a team member than there is to being a part of a group.
How do we change our language and mindset from this sort of institutional model this intentionality top down and programmatically to create a community where we have these deep ongoing friendships.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point that you bring up, right? So even the terminology is super important because words matter. They shape culture, they shape the way that people respond to what's happening in the culture. And I think in many churches, even the word community has some things attached to it that is this assumption that all we really need to do is just be together and care for one another. And then they miss the mission part of what Jesus is asking us to do, right? And it doesn't have to be that way. I'm not saying that, but in a lot of places it is. And so I think it is, worth thinking about, Raymond, and talking about of like, well, how do we do that on both sides, right? Because if we get too far on the mission, the intentionality side, we can miss this idea of, well, yeah, the mission's important, but if we don't love each other, we're not really engaging the mission the way that God asks us to. But we can get too far on the other side and say, well, if we're only loving each other who are here and we have no mind for those who are out there and who don't yet know Jesus, then that's off as well. And so in my mind, we have to get somewhere in the middle of both of those things.
A lot of what we call community in the church is as misunderstood as the mission of the church, because community really is about caring about each other, not just bringing something to the potluck.
And there's two things that teams normally struggle with. And really, it's the two goals we have. The first goal is they become a team. The second is that they become disciple makers. Each individual becomes a disciple maker. And so both are really hard. Both are full of challenges. But as we get to the team, I could tell from being with them occasionally that they weren't really doing that. And so I said, hey, guys, let's just take out a piece of paper. I'm going to ask you some questions and just write down the answers. Okay. And so I said, all right, well, how many of your teammates here, you have 12 of them around the circle that night, how many of them can you name the name of their spouse? Do you know the name of their spouse? How many of them do you know what their spouse does? How many of them do you know a challenge that they have faced as a couple or a family over the past 3 months? Things like this, right? And they didn't do well. And so they're talking about how they didn't do well. And then one lady raised her hand. She says, Justin, I think are you saying that you want us to love each other? And I said, that is exactly what I'm trying to say. Now, we can put it in all sorts of different language, whether it's team language or whether it's, community sorts of language or love language. But the reality is it all points to the same thing, that if we're not willing to get involved in each other's lives, then we're not really doing what Jesus did. Furthermore, if we think we're going to develop a disciple-making culture, the only culture we have to offer the broader church or the broader organization is the culture that we develop right here. And so if we're just talking about it here and we're not actually doing it, when we talk about it over there, there's no model. They're not going to do it. They're going to need to see the difference that it makes. And so I agree completely that, that love piece is central to this idea of forming a culture of disciple making in a church or an organization.
As a soundbite, Justin, I would like to put you into what we call the elevator speech challenge, which is talking about a couple of key things you'd want people to walk away with thinking about your book, Foundations of a Disciple-Making Culture. If you had, say, 45, 60 seconds in an elevator with them, such as the idea of like leading change and what does core mean? Because you threw core in there. Would you give us kind of your elevator speech as you're riding up with Raymond, who is just an unwashed skeptic and really needs to hear good stuff?
My book really focuses on helping pastors figure out how to develop a disciple-making culture in their church. But it also fits for other organizations that are looking for that same sort of thing. And so it looks at, how do we do it? How do we take something that we want to be different in the culture? How do we move it forward? And it would work. The process that I talk about in the book, it pairs with Jesus' model, but it also pairs with secular models that have come out and become the standard, which is not a surprise to me because Jesus did it first and modeled it. But it looks at, how do we develop a team that is going to first model and become what we want the rest of the culture to become. And so we do that through a process of team building, and it's a core team. The core is an acronym: common vision, owned individually, relationally resilient, and enduring to the end. Now, the team is moving through a process of transformation and change. They're moving through it together. And because they're moving through it together, there are points where one person's not struggling, another one is. The next person is struggling, and then so they're helping each other out as they move through it. But the leader is guiding them because he's already become what he's trying to get them to become. The fallacy that a lot of people have is that we can make disciples in mass, that we can enact change through pulling on organizational levers and creating policy or creating, these things and just saying, this is what we're going to do. But we're not actually teaching or developing people to become those things. And so what my book looks at is, how do we do that practically? And how does it work in a church setting? And I think that readers will find that not only will it work in a church setting, it'll work in a workplace setting or other organizational settings where you want to enact change in the place where you're trying to lead.
So if I get done reading this book, Raymond's getting off the elevator, I'm getting on because I'm riding with you up to the penthouse for your book signing there in downtown Chicago. So if I'm riding up the elevator with you and I turn to you and I go like, okay, Justin, read the book, love the book. Can I borrow a metaphor about aviation and just say, look, after I read your book, am I going to know how to fly the plane? Am I going to walk away with this and like, I can go back to my church and get this fixed? Or are you teasing me and I got to bring you in for a consulting gig? What's going on here?
No, you will know how to do it. Will you be able to do it without somebody with some experience? It depends on the leader. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that everybody that reads the book will have the capability to enact the things. But if you're already a disciple maker and you get it, then yeah, you can do it. It's helpful to have somebody next to you, but I'm not trying to get consulting gigs out of this. To be honest, I'm full right now. I don't have space for that. But my goal in writing it is it's a how-to book. It's a how-to book. And the whole time I was writing it, I'm trying to make it as practical as possible so that people can see the problem and move through the stages of culture change. And there's really three main obstacles that we talk about in the book as well. And the main obstacles to change within a culture or within an individual is the first obstacle is seeing, right? We can't even see the difference. And so we have to have some contrast between what is and what could be. And when we bring some of that contrast, then our eyes begin to see things that we hadn't seen before. Okay, once we get past that, and that's the common vision in the core acronym, right? Can we get that common vision together where we're seeing it? All right, if we can get there, the next obstacle is to move. Because there are times when we see, hey, this change would be good for me. That would benefit me. And yet we don't move, right? It might have to do with exercise. It might have to do with our eating habits. It could be a lot of different things that we can see it, but we don't do it because there's that second obstacle of moving. How do we get started and change the movement that we have in our lives? And so again, back to the core acronym, it's owned individually. Yes, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. There's a lot of people in the church that see, yeah, disciple making is good. And maybe I could do it or should do it, but I'm just not going to because of lack of confidence or any other number of things that are holding them back, right? But then we have to get to the final obstacle, which is finish. And the things that keep people in churches and organizations from finishing, especially if we're on a team, are relationship problems with other teammates, not willing to get close enough to be in real relationships, like we were just talking about, not loving well. But then when we get deep in relationships with people, things happen, right? Sin comes out. And then we have to figure out, what are we going to do with that? Are we going to retreat and, kind of wall off the relationship so that we don't go any further? Or are we going to lean in and be honest and work through some hard things together? And then the other one is enduring to the end. That's the finish, right? Because one interesting thing that happens on these teams is right when the team leader is really energized because he sees it moving, he sees the people doing it, he's super energized or she's super energized, and yet the people on the team are exhausted and they want to quit and they just want to go back to the way things were. And we do that too. Think of resolutions that we might enact. Like, all right, we want the change. We start doing the change. And then a few weeks later, we're like, do I really want to? I don't know. It sure seems better to go back and eat that cake and ice cream. And, I don't want to exercise today. And so we start to drift back. Well, if the leader's not really attuned to those things, then we don't help the team move through that finish stage. And so, yes, you can do it.
Let me ask this question just so we can be sure. You spent a fair amount of time in your book trying to clear up terms because terms, as you said, accumulate a lot of rust and people
Yep.
can't recognize them. They can't think about them. What's a disciple maker?
A disciple maker is someone who invests in another for a specific purpose, right? So Jesus was using and leveraging and presenting to us the example of the rabbi-disciple relationship. It was holistic, right? So there's ways to identify, and one of the things that I really look at is, what is the point of the relationship? What's the point, right? Is there an outcome in mind? Because with Jesus, when he invited men and women into disciple making, he invited them specifically, right? Come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. So there was no misunderstanding about why they were following. I'm going to help you become this, right? And what I find is that we can look at markers in disciple making to know, is this thing we've been doing and calling disciple making, is it actually disciple making? Disciple making moves out towards the lost. So there's an element where we are aware that there are people out there in Jesus' mission. He came to seek and save the lost. So if we're on mission with him, we are concerned and moving outward towards those people. It moves in towards the church, right? So we are moving in towards other believers and investing in them and helping them to grow and mature, and also participating so that we're in relationships with others who are helping us mature and to grow. And then it moves down in the life of the individual believer. And so downward, there's depth being developed in their life with God and their relationships with others. And so a disciple maker is somebody who is engaged in all those things. And really, if we want a short, simple answer, Dennis, because that was not one, a short, simple answer would be someone who follows Jesus in order to become just like Jesus, which gets to our motivation. Why am I doing this? I'm doing it to become just like him. I can't become just like him if I'm not willing to invest in others and disciple them the way that he discipled.
A lot of the churches that I end up talking with and interacting with and organizations think of discipleship and disciple making as a one generational event. Would you talk about the multi-generational aspect of a disciple maker? What's the successful marker of a true disciple maker if you think about multi-generational? How do you view that?
Yep. So we need to multiply. We need to reproduce. First place I would think of is 2 Timothy 2:2. Paul is speaking to Timothy, and he says, "In the things you have heard me say, in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others." And so when I'm investing in guys, I will take them to that verse pretty early on. I'll say, how many generations are in that verse? And most of the time they'll say 2 or 3. And I'm like, well, yeah, but Paul's speaking to Timothy. And then Timothy, there's reliable men. And from reliable men, there's others. So there's actually 4 generations. And so there's a multiplicative effect of disciple making. And so a lot of churches just practice addition, right? Let's bring one person in at a time. But what disciple making and the vision of disciple making is that we are investing in people and helping them grow so that they can be like Jesus, which means they're going to become a disciple maker. So when it starts, there's 2 of us, but then both of us are going to go out and find somebody else. And then there's 4 of us. And then after that, all 4 of us are going to go find somebody else. And now there's 8 of us. And so with that multiplication, we can impact people a lot more people in a lot shorter time over time, right? But that multiplication is super important, because if we're not multiplying, if we're just doing discipleship, like you mentioned, and I would define discipleship as investing in somebody else without any movement towards them doing it with somebody else or any mission element to it. So it's just like if I was investing in you, Dennis, doing discipleship, I'd be like helping you grow as a believer. But my goal or our conversation wouldn't be leading you to do that. It would just stop with you. And so, well, now I've added one more to somebody who's mature to the kingdom if you were a non-Christian before. But disciple making is helping you become someone who is committed with vision, heart, and skill to make disciples of others so that it multiplies out. And so, again, 2 Timothy 2:2, each of those four we would refer to as a generation.
Raymond, I'm looking for a complete agreement by you if I try to do a deal here. I'm trying to do a deal with you two groups, right? We got the Gravitt Mafia, we got the Monroe Mafia here, right? And I'm trying to talk about getting these parties together like in a deal, right? So on the one hand, Raymond, you're telling me that you got this love thing going, which is really to deeply love another, being willing to give your life for another, totally loving your community, your neighbors. And then we've got this guy, this Gravitt guy with his mafia, and what he's trying to do, he's trying to help culture start getting what you're saying. You guys are talking about both the individual and you're talking about the culture of the group getting together so that the community is a disciple-making community. Raymond, do I have your buy-in on this? Where are you, Raymond?
Yes.
Or maybe the shortest answer Raymond's
I love
ever
that.
given.
That was unqualified. Yes.
Okay.
As good as I can get there.
Justin, are you with us here? Are you on board? Do we sign the deal?
Absolutely.
All right, so guys, then I need you to untangle one other small problem for me. And the other problem that I got is that you both are going around talking about this idea of the mission, and we're committed to the mission of Jesus. What in the world do you guys mean?
Raymond, I've been talking a while, so I think you should go first.
Oh, I'd be happy to try and do this. John comes along 20, 30 years after the synoptics are written and says, I don't think you really got it. When it said, teach them my commandments, it's not about being as morally perfect as Jesus, but it's about showing the love of the fathers to one another. And so basically, I think the whole core of what it means, the intent of discipleship is to love one another the way Jesus loved us in that self-sacrificial way. So to me, the core verse of discipleship isn't the Great Commission. It is really John in the Last Supper where Jesus says, the one way people will really know that you're my disciples, the characteristic of being a disciple is that you love one another the way I love you.
Are you saying to me that Matthew 28 doesn't account or apply to your thinking here, Dr. Monroe?
Oh, no. Matthew says, teach them my commandments. And Jesus and all the synoptics says, love God and love. In Matthew especially, do we really, as part of discipleship, teach people to live up to the Sermon on the Mount? We tend to reduce discipleship to evangelism and Bible study, not a life submitted to Christ where we're loving other people the way he taught us to. You can't love God and money. When's the last time you heard that from a pulpit?
Which page of the book do I need to go to? Foundation of a Disciple-Making Culture. Where do I need to go to help get this guy on track?
I don't disagree with what he's saying. I would get there a little differently. I would say that the Great Commission is fueled by the Great Commandment. And so if we try to disconnect the two or divorce the two, then we get off track. And so I think love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those two, right? The Great Commandments. If we're doing that, then it fuels, it gives fire and energy to the Great Commission. If we simply try to fulfill the Great Commission without giving our first energy and our first attention and focus to the Great Commandment, then we get off track and we end up doing things in programmatic ways or in ways that mimic the world and what they're trying to do rather than what Jesus and his kingdom is trying to and is becoming and will become here on earth. And so, again, I don't disagree with Raymond, but I would get there a little bit differently. And so that's how I think about it, is that Great Commandment has to fuel the Great Commission, and we can't put the Great Commission before the Great Commandment.
And I would say amen to what he just said. Absolutely. That our motivation, primary motivation, is to love God and love our neighbor. And that should result in a life of service and sacrifice to others. I would probably be still different than Justin, because I think as an ordinary guy doing engineering work, my engineering work is as much as my discipleship as anything I'm doing intentionally about sharing the gospel. And so discipleship is about everything I do, not just the churchy stuff.
Well, okay. I like that. And I want to congratulate you for not bringing up the plumber illustration today, by the way. That was really good. I was impressed that you didn't go back to that. So, okay, you guys, I'm with you. I buy it. I love it, right? But so now here's the deal, right? You wrote the book, Justin. Come on. You wrote this book. Raymond, you're a business guy. We've talked about the mission thing. You defined the mission. I love the way you set the mission up. The Great Commandment fits in with the Great Commission. I love this. This is one. How do you measure this, guys? What are the metrics? I want metrics. How do I know I'm succeeding?
Ow. I'm glad it dumped it on you. I would push back that a metric is an institutional term, not a community term. Go for it, Justin.
That's very true. So we can have metrics, and I think they're somewhat important as indicators of what we're doing, but we can't push too much into them because they can be dangerous too. And the danger can come from just trying to get to the metric, trying to get to that, whatever the mile marker is, as opposed to loving the people to get there, right? And so some of the metrics that we have, again, with the core team, are we a team? How do we define if we're a team? Well, we can see it, right? We can see it and we can ask questions to determine it. Part of what we see is, well, are people coming? And if they're not coming, how are they responding to that? How are they communicating that to one another? What's the heart behind when they're saying, hey, I have this conflict? So first one, are we a team? The second one is, are we disciple makers? Well, if we're disciple makers, then we are in an intentional relationship with someone like Jesus is and was, and like he modeled, right? And so if we're doing that and we see progress, there's both relationship and intentionality. I think, again, we have to have both. Then, okay, we're disciple makers. Once we see some reproduction, multiplication, that's kind of the highest bar of like, are you a disciple maker? Well, has someone you discipled made a disciple? Then that's kind of the highest bar.
Seems to me you were talking about a mustard seed sort of strategy. You've got to find those mustard seeds. Could you talk a little bit more about, in your wrap up, about finding those mustard seeds for the kind of multiplication we need?
Yep. It is a mustard seed strategy. It's starting with the small, starting with the insignificant, starting with the individuals. And through the individual, we can see the nations, right? So if we can invest in individuals, disciple them so that they can go and do the same, we can build chains of disciple makers that multiply out, then we will get to the nation.
Justin, as I think about what you've written and going back to this concept of the danger facing a pastor, somebody trying to make a change inside an organization, I'm thinking about some of Tim Keller's work where he started describing churches based on size. You had house churches and small churches and medium-sized churches, really big churches. That's sort of your y-axis. And then across the x-axis, you've got the cultural tenure. Do you have a startup church? Do you have some church where the original pastor, the founding pastor, is still in there and driving things and he's sort of the beloved person? Do you have a church that's more mature with maybe a couple of cycles of pastors who haven't been around long? Or, it's a church that's really fossilized and ossified in terms of it's been there for years and years and years, and it's got this very rigid culture. So kind of with this idea of head count and this idea of tenure of culture, you talked about Professor John Cotter a lot and leadership and leading change. How does all that kind of advise a pastor about danger and the perils of trying to do something like this?
Yeah, so the reality is creating lasting culture change is really difficult. And what Cotter has found and what we've found similarly is, around 70%, give or take, fail at it. And I think the percentages go up when you have somebody alongside you that's been through it before and that can help you with it. But it doesn't change the fact that it's really hard. And so some of the perils, I think, is, leaders have to be wise. They have to exercise, wisdom in terms of how they're communicating. We don't recommend that pastors or leaders announce the revolution before it's arrived, right? You got to build this thing, and it takes time, and it's a slow burn in the background for a while as you develop some disciple makers. Another book that's been really helpful around the idea of change within organizations is a book called It Starts With One by J. Stewart Black. And I love the title, but I also love the title because he backs it up with what he's talking about, that if we don't build individuals that are modeling and are the change that we hope to see in the organization, then we don't have any hope of it taking root in the culture. And so I think a lot of the danger for pastors who are trying to do this is trying to do it, again, with organizational levers rather than relationally.
Okay, Justin, we've had you on before with Navigator Church Ministry. Here you are with a book, Foundation of a Disciple-Making Culture, and this building of a core team. How do we stalk and creep you? When's the book coming out? Where's the book going to be available?
Yep, the book will be available pretty much everywhere you can find books, Amazon, wherever. It's going to be released on September 10th. You can find me at my website, justingravitt.com. Again, there's a free resource there if you're an everyday disciple maker or want to become a disciple maker. There's a free resource called the Bicycle Illustration there that might be helpful to you. I would also encourage you to check out, especially church leaders, Navigators Church Ministries.com. And if there's a way that we can help you, we have a team spread across the nation of over 100 people who walk alongside pastors and church leaders. And we also are looking for others, right? A lot of our team are former pastors and church leaders that God has called them to kind of help other pastors with culture building and specifically culture building around disciple making. So those would be the places I'd point you guys to. And
so, Justin, thanks so much for joining us. This has been a delight. I'm thrilled with your book and especially your emphasis on discipleship. It's something we're somewhat passionate about as well.
That's
and
right.
because of that, it's just a delight to have a conversation with you. So thanks for joining us and appreciate your time.
Appreciate being on. Appreciate the work that you guys do around disciple making around the country. And your podcast is awesome. And I love being with you every time I'm here.
Would you help the church think more about discipleship? Would you help us get the conversation started to talk about the biblical discipleship Jesus gave us? Please follow us. Our website, www.thediscipledilemma.com. You can find us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and all the RSS feeds. If you'd follow or like us, you'll help us get leverage in the digital marketplace to talk about the fact that discipleship needs to be talked about. And as always, folks, thanks for listening.